economic growth, military modernization changes that equation considerably. The DPP's candidate has made no indication she plans to move in the direction of independence. And in fact, in the next few days, Ma Ying-jeou and Xi Jinping are going to have a meeting, the first meeting between the heads of the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China in 66 years. Now, Ma Ying-jeou is a dead duck, excuse me, a lame duck. He's on his way out, he's unpopular, his party is not going to retain control of the presidency. However, the Pan Blue, which is the Kuomintang and the People First Party, are likely to retain control over the parliament. And we're going to go back to where we were with Chen Shui-bian. Divided government likely means that the two sides can checkmate each other. So I don't see significant movement in that front, but anything to do with the relationship between Taiwan and the mainland can create problems. And particularly for the United States officially has a one China policy, which if you actually go back and read the Shanghai Communique, says that we understand that you think there's one China, you, the Chinese people. We don't actually say what we think in the Shanghai Communique. We have, are there any official representatives here from the US government or otherwise? We actually have a two-China policy. We would like to have full diplomatic relations with the two. But both sides say you can't do that, so we side with the bigger of the two Chinas and have informal relations with Taiwan. We would prefer that the status quo in the Taiwan Straits prevail. Taiwan de facto independent, but not de jure. Anytime there are tensions between Taiwan and the mainland, the US gets drawn in, which complicates things. So that, you know, my read is that the DPP is going to win the election. There'll be excitement, there'll be fanfare, and not much will actually change. But not much has to change in order to complicate the relationship across the Taiwan Straits, and by extension then, complicate the already complicated relationship between Washington and Beijing. And of course, the reality is, China is rapidly closing in on superpower status. And the question is, what does China want when it's a superpower? What does it expect in terms of regional aspirations? What does it expect in terms of global aspirations? Throw into this also the ongoing dispute between China and Japan over the Diaoyutai or Senkaku Islands. Again, complicates US-China relations in that we are obligated by treaty to come to Japan's aid should it be attacked. Of course, there are two things. One, what constitutes an attack, and two, treaties are just pieces of paper. Push comes to shove. You know, what can Japan do to us if we don't come to their aid? They could sue us, I suppose. I don't see that coming either, but again, a complicating factor in US-China relations, particularly because Japan has been relatively assertive or aggressive on the issue as well. So, in some ways, on the political outlook, not that much new, lots of ongoing issues and so forth. And I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Prime.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. Great. I just want to say thank you to my students who are here, and a few of them have class at 9, so they're going to sneak out. So but I appreciate them coming early to share in this. And I'd also like to thank the Georgia-China Alliance, which is our third main partner in this program and has been for a number of years that we do this China breakfast briefing. So the economy. In some sense, there's not all that much new either in the economy. So the so-called new normal in China's economy is that growth is slowing. And the question is, two questions there. One is it really growing as fast as they say? And the other question is, will it slowly slow down or will it crash? So we call that the soft landing or the hard landing kind of question. In terms of, is it really growing at 6.9%, which was the last quarterly announcement? Probably not, but I don't think it's too far from that. So it's not that it's growing at 2 or 3 and they're claiming that it's 6.9 in order to sort of keep up the show of growth. But the slowing of the growth is actually expected and a good thing to have happen, given that the economy can't grow for 8 or 9 or 10% forever. So the question is always about that transition from high growth to middle growth and how that's managed and what's going to pick up the new growth. And to China's leaders' credit, they're very aware of all of these kinds of analysis and what they need to do and how it could work out well. So what I see is some very weak sectors and some very strong rising sectors, which is what we should see. So in some sense, I'm fairly optimistic. So on the negative side, there's a lot of weak sectors that all of you know about in terms of state-owned industries. There's overcapacity in steel and in glass and even in energy now because of falling prices and of course in the housing sector. So there's a lot of overinvestment in a number of different places, and moving resources out of those sectors into new sectors is really where China's challenge is, because most of those sectors are state-owned, and there are vested interests in those big companies that don't want, they don't really want it to change, and so that part's a little bit stuck. So just taking the housing sector for a minute, the buildup in housing is just awesome, and not necessarily in the good way. So if you travel around China, you see new apartment buildings literally everywhere. So you go to a small village in Shandong province, for example, and even they have an apartment building going up. It's not 25, 50 stories, but it's 10 or 12, and it's not finished. Some of them are not finished. Some of them have been stopped, so you're just kind of sitting there. Others are finished and not filled. But again, it depends on where you are in China. So around Shanghai, eastern Jiangsu, and the big cities, of course, Beijing and Shanghai, they can fill those apartments. I mean, that is just not going to be a problem. But that's not where all of the construction is. And so, we know about the ghost cities, and if you visit a ghost city, it really is impressive about acres and acres and acres of buildings that aren't being used and either not finished or are already crumbling. And so you have infrastructure as well that's been built, airports in places where there are no airplanes, but a lot of the airports that have been built actually are being used and have generated new activity. And one example I'll give you is in Zhengzhou. Zhengzhou was a sleepy place 10 years ago, and they built this airport, and they actually made it an entryway from Taiwan, so you could fly directly from Taipei to Zhengzhou and go through customs. And Zhengzhou is booming today. Lots of industry has moved there. They're rebuilding their education, universities, and I mean, it's quite startling, and it's just in the middle of nowhere in central China. So some of this can actually work in terms of building the infrastructure, build it and they will come. I think part of the issue here is kind of tied up in the program for urbanization. Right? One of the ideas is if people move from the countryside to the cities, they earn more money, they have higher wages, they're more productive, and this comes out of economic theory, and we see this in economic development transitions. We see it in the US. If you live in the city, your wages are higher than if you don't. And so the policy is to try to urbanize China a little faster than it might have happened on its own. And I think this part has gotten a little stuck because there are a lot of people in the countryside who not sure what they would do if they moved to the cities. And by cities here we mean sometimes townships, right? Not necessarily big cities. So trying to create more middle-sized cities across China, not everybody moving to Beijing, although that's where everybody wants to be. So it's kind of stuck. So we talked to some people who, they have the option to move to the city, but they said, well, what are we going to do when we're in the city? At least when we're in the countryside, we can farm and we can do some non-agriculture kinds of activities and, do okay, and cost of living is low. So if we move to the city, we need a job, but what are we going to do? And so the government is kind of pushing people to move to the cities, but not forcing them to. So far, so that's good. But I think in some ways it's kind of stuck for this reason. And we talked to some people who moved to the cities and then moved back. It was like, well, we didn't really like that. And other people move to the cities and do okay, but it's not this big urbanization, sort of natural, there's jobs, so of course we're going to move there. Now some of that's already happened. As we know, migrant workers have gone to the cities and gone to the special economic zones, and now we're going to Zhengzhou to work in factories. And some of that is drawing on the local labor markets now instead of long distance. And so that's more healthy, I think, and distributing industry and around. But there's clearly not enough jobs for everyone who is living in rural areas and farming. So in some sense, that investment has gotten ahead of where it needs to be in the economy. So we have overall this diminishing returns to investment in China. And investment, as you know, has been very, very high. And it's grown, so it's like 50% of GDP. And so the benefits of that are dissipating. So on the other side is is what I would say sort of the driving sectors, the growing sectors. And here it's exactly what the policymakers want and what we would see in economic theory, which is, so you want the consumer-led growth, you want service-led growth. And if you look at what areas are growing in China, it's consumer spending, it's the retail sector, it's e-commerce, it's travel, it's education, it's health services, it's all of those things that, well, that's what, that was the plan, right? So that looks pretty good, and it's quite exciting. So we've done interviews with companies who are filling niches in terms of B2B services, in terms of household services, and it's very competitive. Most of it is private, so this is the growing private sector. And it's quite innovative. They're using new e-platforms to do all kinds of new ways to do business. They're interested in filing patents, and really there's a lot of excitement there. And there's pockets of this. So of course it's much more in East China and in urban areas than it is in the countryside. I mean, I must say the countryside does seem a little grim, in that respect. But even there, tourism, so the villages will sometimes take their homes and remodel them, and they become bed and breakfast, they're weekend resorts, and people in China like to go off into the countryside in the weekend and get fresh air, and so there is just this middle class is there, and they're spending money, and they're growing, and they are driving that part of the economy. So it's that part's pretty exciting. So I think the question is, how do you get from here to there, right? How do you move enough of the resources away from the declining sectors into the rising sectors? And I think that part they're kind of stuck.